One, two, three, four. Attention all online participants. We will be starting the stream shortly. Thank you for your patience.
We're about to get started here. If we could have folks take their seats. Thanks so much. Jamil.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Jamil Jaffer, and I direct the Knight First Amendment Institute here at Columbia. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to the launch and celebration of the Aryeh Neier Oral History Project. This is a project of Columbia's Insight Institute, whose mission is to produce knowledge for public action, joining people and organizations from within and outside the university through novel forms of assembly, research, archiving, and learning, all guided by the aim of making societies more just and more equitable. Insight houses the Center for Oral History Research, which is one of the world's most distinguished centers for the practice and teaching of oral history. The center's projects include the 9/11 Oral History Project, which interviewed hundreds of New Yorkers about their experiences in September 2001 and afterwards, the Guantanamo Rule of Law Project, a project on the life of artist Robert Rauschenberg, and the recently completed oral history of the Obama presidency. The Aryeh Neier Project, which now becomes a part of that collection, grew out of a grant that the Open Society Foundations made in the spring of 2022 to explore Aryeh's life, influence, and legacy. Aryeh's influence on the field of human rights has been truly staggering, as all of you know. Few people have made so deep a mark on this field, and even fewer human rights advocates have made such an immense difference in the world. Many of you had the opportunity to work alongside Aryeh at the ACLU or Human Rights Watch or the Open Society Foundations. I didn't have that opportunity myself. Anthony Romero hired me at the ACLU in 2002, which was long after Aryeh had left the organization. But Aryeh was a legendary figure even then, a kind of avatar of fearlessness and integrity. When I launched the Knight Institute 8 years ago, it was Aryeh I turned to for advice, and it was Aryeh who delivered the keynote address at the Knight Institute's first significant public event. It was a formidable defense of free speech at a moment of ascendant authoritarianism. Even in recent weeks, as we've all been struggling as advocates and citizens to make sense of the events in Israel and Gaza, Aryeh's principled and courageous approach to this subject has been a model for me, as I know it has been for so many of you. Many other people are going to talk about Aryeh this evening, and I don't want to steal any more of their thunder than I already have. What I do want to do is introduce Benaifer Navroji, who has just taken the reins at OSF. It's really a wonderful thing that Benaifer has this role. Wonderful for OSF, but also for the larger world of human rights. She comes to the role with deep expertise in Africa and Asia, where she developed and executed initiatives promoting social justice and equality. She previously held several senior positions within OSF, including East Africa Foundation Director and Regional Director for Asia Pacific. Before that, she was associated with Human Rights Watch and the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights. She's worked extensively on prosecuting sexual violence under international law, and she testified as an expert witness at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Like Aryeh, Benaifer is an immigrant who has a deep personal understanding of how much is at stake in the struggle for human rights. She's spoken movingly and powerfully about the experience of living under Daniel Arap Moi's government in Kenya, which was at that time engaged in brutal persecution of political rivals and dissidents. It's a great inspiration to me, and I know to many other human rights lawyers as well, to have Benaifer leading the Open Society Foundations at this particular moment. Please join me in welcoming her.
So good evening to everybody. This is the ultimate family reunion, I feel, of people in my life for the last 30 years. And I'm someone who's just followed Aryeh around and been completely influenced by him. So let me start by saying that Aryeh is well named. In Hebrew, Aryeh means lion. And he's very much that. Lions have many qualities: strength, courage, and most importantly, a powerful roar that they command respect and attention with. And that truly is who Aryeh is. I've learned many things from Aryeh, and there'll be lots said, and I just want to speak from my heart here and just say how influential Aryeh has been in my life. I have learned from him so many things, but first and foremost, the courage of conviction. And here, watching Aryeh over the years, always standing tall for the right thing, even if it's difficult to say, even if it's defending my enemy, even if it's genocide in Israel, Aryeh will stand up for the right thing. And that example, that exemplar, has been truly powerful to watch. There is no compromising on principles of human rights for Aryeh. The second thing is that when Aryeh set out in his career, he really framed things around the area of human rights, not social justice, not humanitarian law. It really was a North Star to ensure that there was a focus on looking at the international human rights standards, and then breathing life into them and building a movement, a global movement. And very early on, Aryeh was going to places with very dark moments and shining a light on what was happening. For me, this was in the 1990s in Kenya, at a very dark moment when my own father was coming into trouble with the government, and Aryeh was one of the people that visited and actually did a lot of work around the persecution of lawyers in Kenya at the time. So it's very personal to me that Aryeh took the time at that moment when no one was looking at Kenya to make sure that there were people standing up for others. Working with Aryeh is a joy. He's somebody who's a real talent spotter, and he built a whole network, not just of staff, but also these advisory committees that had all sorts of people who came together. And Maya Daruwala, who's an Indian activist, and tells a story that she met Aryeh, and he said, "Will you serve on the board of," I think it was OSJI, right, Jim? And later on, she said, many years later, she said to him, "You didn't even know me, and you asked me to serve on this board. How did you know I'd be the right person?" And she said, Aryeh just looked at her, and he shrugged his shoulders. And that's he just has a knack for talent spotting and building this incredible global network that those of you who sit here tonight are part of and will continue to be for a long time. When I first started at Open Society, I had just turned 40, and I was asked to open the Kenya office. I was given $1 million and a cell phone, and I couldn't believe that somebody would trust me with that level of responsibility, that scale of funding, and even the idea that somebody from a place like Kenya could actually be the one who'd do that and look at that, because it always felt that those kinds of people came from New York or London, never from Kenya. And so it was really, for me, quite a transformative professional experience to be given that much trust. And Aryeh did that. He gave us huge amounts of trust to build things, and it gave you the incentive to actually, and the responsibility to really not squander that in any way. And Aryeh also, through it all, I think he just exemplifies humility. It's a quiet strength. It's never one about himself, and that humility is something I've also learned from. And I remember one time when I came to him with something on Sudan, and I said to him, I'm not sure, are we doing the right thing here? And he said, I'm not sure either. I've never been to Sudan, and so I don't know if that's the right answer. And it was the first time I'd had a boss that said, I don't know, it may be, but I'm not sure. And that was also a learning for me, that humility, that not having all the answers. Let me just say that in my leadership at Open Society now as the president, it is to Aryeh that I look to model my leadership, to model where Open Society Foundations goes. And it is, I always ask myself, what would Aryeh do when I have a conundrum? And in fact, I say it not infrequently, that even my husband knows this. What would Aryeh do? He teases me. What would Aryeh do? I mean, you're going to wear that dress? Should you wear that dress? What would Aryeh say? But I do. So let me just stop there just to say, this is a giant whose shoulders many of us stand on. And the turnout here tonight is a witness to that. And there would be many more, I'm sure, on a screen if we were doing this virtually. Just to say, Aryeh, how much I love you, how much I treasure you, and how much you've influenced me in my life. Thank you.
Thank you, Benaifer. Thank you, Jamil, for those remarks. Thank you all for coming. I'm Evan McCormick, the Director of Research at Insight Institute here at Columbia University. It's a pleasure to be with you all tonight celebrating Aryeh Neier. After this panel, I want to remind everyone we'll be continuing the celebration in a reception outside in the foyer. Before I turn things over to our panel here, I want to set the stage by saying a few words about the Oral History Project that is the occasion that brings us together tonight. We're excited to give you a preview of that oral history in the conversation we're about to have, but also outside, as you make your way to the foyer, you'll see a number of interactive kiosks. On those kiosks, if you take a moment during the reception, you'll be able to explore some of the key themes from the oral history interviews, as well as listen to a few select audio clips that preview the collection. The Aryeh Neier Oral History Project comprises 24 interviews with some of Mr. Neier's closest associates, colleagues, and collaborators from the organizations that he led. Many of the narrators, as we call them in the oral history business, are here with us tonight. The interviews were recorded between 2022 and 2023, many over multiple sessions. Mr. Neier himself sat for 12 sessions for the project. In all, the archive includes more than 75 hours of audio material and accompanying transcripts, which will be archived in the oral history archives at Columbia Libraries for students, researchers, and members of the public to make use of for decades to come. Those facts describe the project, but they don't tell you the full story. Oral history projects entail serious intellectual and administrative work. I would be remiss to not begin by acknowledging the contributions of so many people who made this project possible. We are really grateful to Open Society Foundations for making this project and tonight's celebration possible. And we would like to thank specifically Kate Antonich, Alex Krasny, and Claudia Hernandez for modeling the kind of partnership that enables a project like this one to succeed. Thank you. And of course, we would like to thank Mr. Neier himself, whose generosity was really unmatched in sharing his memories over 12 sessions, but also his thoughts and feedback on the overall shape of this project as it was unfolding. So thank you, Aryeh. I also want to acknowledge the hard work of the team at Insight and the Columbia Center for Oral History Research that brought this project idea to life. Our project director and project manager, Sarah Sinclair and Rebecca McGilvray, respectively, could not be here with us tonight, but it was their tireless work that helped make sure that the interviews happened, were recorded, and have been prepared for the archive. In the hopes that they're watching remotely, I want to take a second to thank Sarah and Rebecca as well. Thanks. There are many other folks to mention: principal investigators Mary Marshall Clark and Michael Falco, Chris Panza, who built the website that you're going to see, hopefully during the reception on those interactive kiosks, and Peter Behrman, our founding director of Insight, who is with us tonight. Tonight's event offers a glimpse of what we do at Insight in two ways. The first is this moderated conversation, which will mimic the engagement with memory and reflection that happens in an oral history interview. Oral history asks people to become storytellers, to make sense of the memories and experiences that make up their lives. And in projects like these, we ask them to do that around a central reference point. In this case, Aryeh Neier, the work that they did with him under his leadership and in light of his legacy. Now, in any oral history project, there are many questions that get asked. At the end of an oral history project, there's usually one question that gets asked, and that's, what did you learn? But answering this question is complicated. Collecting many interviews, the aim is not to sustain one definitive historical argument or one characterization of a person's legacy. The work is to build an archive that's capable of answering questions that people will ask of it from future standpoints. This will certainly be the case of the Aryeh Neier Oral History Project as it deals with his work in the fields of free speech, human rights, and global democracy. So tonight in our conversation, we will ask some of these first questions in that longer reflective exercise. And oral history is just one of the forms that research takes at Insight. The second piece of Insight that you'll see in tonight's event is our broader mission to create knowledge for public action, to widen the very idea of where we think knowledge comes from, breaking down barriers between the academy and those for whom knowledge comes from experience, organizing, leading, creating. That is the mission that joins our diverse projects, from the Labor Lab to the Obama Presidency Oral History Project that was recently completed, to other oral history projects like Movements Against Mass Incarceration or the Baldwin Emerson Elders Project. It also runs through our fellowship and grant programs like Assembling Voices and Global Change Program, which seek to support and learn from those who are working to confront the most pressing challenges to a more democratic, just, and equitable world. Our mode is assembly, creating opportunities through our projects for people to come together to foster a constant exchange of knowledge between the worlds of the university and for those who are doing, creating, and leading. So tonight you are going to see one glimpse of such assembly, and thus, without any further ado, I'm going to turn things over to our panel moderator, Lenny Bernardo, who will introduce our panelists and get that conversation started. Lenny, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Evan, and Benaifer, thank you for your beautiful tribute to Aryeh. We're thrilled to have participated in this oral history project, not only because Columbia is the gold standard, the Giorgio Armani of oral history, and we're thrilled to be a part of that, but just because how fundamental it is to have this now as part of the so-called historical record. And to be together with Nadine Strawson and Juan Mendez and my old friend Tawanda Mutasa is also a great tribute and honor. I'm not going to go through their quite detailed, protracted, elongated, courageous, in some cases, biographies. You could just Google that. I think it's more important for us to sort of just dig into some aspects of the Aryeh experience. I should say that coming back from upstate yesterday, I was listening to what would be called today a podcast. When it was recorded, it was just an event in 1980 that Aryeh was a part of at the New York Institute for the Humanities. This was a very brief Neier interregnum in between his kind of monster-like positions. It's something he speaks about not a lot, and in fact, we have Juan from the human rights period, of course, Nadine from the ACLU period, Tawanda from many periods, but including OSF. There's no one here from the Institute for the Humanities. And I want to say that listening, Aryeh, to this conversation about censorship and writing from 1980 with Bob Silvers, as you recall, from the New York Review of Each Other's Books, chairing it, and with Susan Sontag and Joseph Brodsky and Richard Sennett and Aryeh himself opining on questions that are as relevant today as they were then. It was very powerful to me driving back yesterday from upstate. But a couple of things that I do want to say, and I've shared this with Aryeh before, we're at Columbia University, the place in which I dropped out of. And I dropped out of it to come work for Aryeh. And I've told Aryeh that he really is my PhD advisor who had little interest in me back in the day. And so I finished with that PhD with Aryeh, and I'm all the stronger for it. But since we're at Columbia, I thought it might be interesting to ask Nadine, if Aryeh were president instead of Manu Shafik last year, I'm sorry for the provocation, but just go with it, what would Aryeh have done differently from Manu Shafik?
Wow. I have with me two props, by the way, which will help to inform my answer to that question. One is Aryeh's first installment of his memoir, and I hope that we can look forward to a second installment. This one came out in 2003, so many more years to cover, called Taking Liberties. And he does describe what he actually did do in his actual then capacity in 1968 with the New York Civil Liberties Union concerning what happened at Columbia then, sadly similar to the events that took place this spring, with the police being called in and multiple arrests and allegations of brutality. But let me also show you my second prop here, because this is not only Aryeh's most extended treatise on free speech, it continues to be one of the best that has ever been written. And I have to tell you, I read everything I can about free speech. This is called, and I think the title was alluded to, Defending My Enemy, American Nazis, the Skokie Case, and the Risks of Freedom, originally published in 1979, written immediately after Aryeh, in his capacity as executive director of the ACLU, courageously and notwithstanding enormous intimidation and insults and threats from inside and outside the ACLU, and worldwide attention and worldwide hostility. At least social media didn't exist at the time, but people used the existing means of communication to torment Aryeh for being Jewish and standing up for the rights of expression that was anti-Semitic. This is also, of course, relevant to the Columbia situation, because many people believe a lot of the expression that is taking place there is anti-Semitic. Aryeh, in my view, and let me just say, I have reread Defending My Enemy so many times I've lost track of it. I had last read it in 2017 in preparation for a book I wrote on hate speech, of which there was no more important contribution to my thinking than Aryeh's book. But in preparation for this event, I reread it, and every time I reread it, I have new insights and new understanding and new admiration for Aryeh. Before I say more about your specific question, Lenny, let me just say that I have the privilege of announcing that there is going to be a republication of Defending My Enemy by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, in collaboration with Aryeh. Because during a recent podcast that was hosted by Nico Perino at FIRE, he gave a reading list about freedom of speech, and it basically included John Stuart Mill and Aryeh Neier were the top recommendations. And he immediately started getting complaints from some of the audience saying, oh, I went onto Amazon, and the only way you can buy this book is to spend $400 because it's out of print. So we did some exploration publication. It is timeless, it is timely, and it's time that a new edition come out, and Aryeh has agreed that he will do a new introduction. So one of the things that's so great about Aryeh's leadership of all of the organizations in which he's played such a terrific role is his consistent, steadfast, even-handed, and fair defense of all of the freedoms that are at stake for everybody. I have no doubt that were Columbia so fortunate as to have been led by an Aryeh Neier, that he would have stood up for freedom of speech for everybody, regardless of what side of the controversies they were exercising their expression on, whether he agreed or disagreed with what they were saying. I have no doubt that he would be attentive to the meaningful free speech rights and equal access rights of everybody in the community, which means not only not punishing speech that should be protected, but punishing expression that should be punished because it is disrupting the educational and speech and other educational opportunities for members of the community. I also have no doubt, and this was certainly demonstrated back in 1968, that Aryeh would be completely focused on minimizing due process violations and undue force and disproportionate reliance on law enforcement, and being sure that law enforcement did not exercise abuse in conducting the arrests. One of the many issues that Aryeh brought to light in his leadership of NYCLU was police abuse, long before it became a cause célèbre in the public as a whole. And one of the specific actions that was taken under his leadership in 1968, he was here at the Columbia campus monitoring what was happening and witnessing and documenting, providing the kind of oral report that we were relying on then in the days before we could all, videotape everything. And under Aryeh's leadership, I think something like 1,000 interviews were conducted of students who had been arrested, and detailed reports were compiled, and that resulted in a comprehensive, detailed analysis of the police excessive force that was the most detailed account that had ever been produced of police abuse in the United States, second only to a subsequent one that came out a little bit later with respect to the Chicago Convention in 1968.
Nadine, thank you for that. And as you all know, Nadine was president of the American Civil Liberties Union from 1991 to 2008. I did want to say, an event that we held for Aryeh, this is kind of round two. There was round one maybe 15 years ago. And remember Gara speaking as the MC, the Master of Ceremonies in DC, saying something very powerful and poignant and resonated with me so directly, which was that Aryeh has always prized principle over ideology. And I saw that early on when I was a young whippersnapper trying to catch his attention in the late 90s with some of my far-left heroes at the time. I would raise them with Aryeh, like Alexander Coburn, who he would sort of dismiss with a sort of swat of a hand. And, I was a little bit crushed at the time because these were sort of left figures that I revered. But I didn't realize that it wasn't so much that Aryeh disliked who they were, but more what they represented. And they represented an ideological position rather than a principled position. And I think that fault line has retained itself insistently over the years, a very powerful fault line. But Juan, I'm interested as someone who spent many years from 82 to 96 with Human Rights Watch, the last 2 as general counsel. The world has changed dramatically from when you were ensconced in Human Rights Watch. And the famous kind of Keynesian line, when the facts change, I change my mind, what do you do? Have you changed your mind on some of the kind of fundamental principles that you upheld and that you engaged and worked with Aryeh on since that time? Or are you sort of steady state?
Well, first, let me thank the Oral History Project for the privilege of being asked to participate in the project itself and now in this event, and particularly for being able to see so many friends from different parts of my career, and particularly I'm very proud to be invited to speak about Aryeh's contribution to the human rights movement. In response to your question, I would say, Lenny, that the situation of human rights today in the world still requires Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. It requires all of our efforts, and we cannot claim to have, created a world in which the decency and humanity of every person is respected, but we have contributed to put human rights in the agenda of international relations in a way that at least gives us hope that there are means and methods and remedies that we can exercise to try to prevent violations from happening in the first place, but also when they actually happen, to have a principled response. In that sense, my trajectory hasn't changed, but I learned with Aryeh to work on human rights regardless of my sympathies or antipathies to the regime that was, causing or producing those violations. And that has remained with me, and it is still with me, but I have to say that I learned it. I didn't start out being kind of an impartial observer and activist for the human rights of all people, including those with whom I don't agree. But I have learned to that is the proper way of defending human rights. And I particularly think that we learned not only how to defend our credibility by being impartial, and not neutral, but impartial. And I think that's there's a significant difference in those two concepts. But we also contributed to expanding the scope of the work of human rights organizations to include, in the first place, for example, we led the way to incorporating international humanitarian law as a way of assigning responsibility for human rights violations, and not only on governments and states, but also on non-state actors, particularly insurgencies, and hold them to account for the violations that they committed. And we also expanded the scope of human rights by working not only on the immediate release of prisoners who were wrongly imprisoned, not only respecting the right of the mothers of the disappeared to demand to know the fate and whereabouts of their children, but we also insisted on the right to justice, even after the violations ended, to provide accountability for human rights violations. And we made it a point to say that that responsibility is, of course, first and foremost of the state that commits the violations, but it is also the responsibility of the government that succeeds dictatorial governments, and they may be very democratic and very respectable in many different ways, but they also have responsibilities to provide accountability for the crimes of the recent past. And I think all of that we did under the guidance of Aryeh, and taking, as we said, the principled positions that these things apply until we see justice done. And they've become now part of international human rights law. They've become part of the normative framework under which we all work on human rights around the world.
Of course, Juan is referring to the period of the military dictatorship in Argentina from 76 to 83 that you were a victim of, incarcerated and tortured for a year until you were able to leave. Do you feel that the lessons, Juan, from Argentina and that deeply repellent period, as we're looking at a very reactionary regime today in Argentina, have those lessons been learned?
Yeah, they have been learned, and I think, of course, the struggle for human rights is never ending, and there's always setbacks. There's always, pushback from authoritarian and repressive forces, even in democracies, sad to say. But I also feel very strongly that even the Argentine society may have made a very bad mistake in electing a person who, revels in insulting everybody and in pushing back on all the democratic gains that have been made over the last more than 40 years in Argentina. But I also feel that we have residual principles and institutions, civil society organizations, but also institutions of the state that are there in place to prevent the worst from happening. I'm not optimistic that we can do it in the very near future, but I do believe that the Argentine society, and not only in Argentina, but in other Latin American countries as well, has learned lessons from repressive regimes and from anti-democratic regimes, and will find a way of pushing back on this, revisionist ideas that are populating Argentina today, and will maintain the principle that dictatorial regimes, and particularly regimes emanating from coup d'etat, will not happen again in Argentina, and these efforts at revisionism will also fail because we have learned lessons and we have built institutions to make those lessons be steadfast and current.
Tawanda, you, in a way, came of professional age. You've had a storied career, obviously with OSF, helping set up OSISA, being a global director, now with Oxfam, with Amnesty. You've been through a lot, but you came of age really in many ways in the 90s when the South African Constitution of 94, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 96, seemed to be the kind of harbingers of something very different. A set of institutions, a set of political commitments, a set of norms that would take us to a broader environment where rights and justice insinuated itself really into all fabrics of state and society. And things sort of went south. Things did not turn out in the way that we would have liked them to. And the scene today when we look at South Africa. The scene today, when we look at international justice, is markedly different from the optimism, the hope that we had when you and I were starting out. What happened?
Thank you, Lenny. I think I would also just start by acknowledging the Oral History Project and the opportunity to contribute to this conversation and to see so many friends. For those of you that like music, that are not just serious lawyers and so on in the room, Clarence Carter, the Irreverend and salacious Clarence Carter, came to Zimbabwe when I was a small boy. At some point, I think Zimbabwe or South Africa. But I remember he was on TV being interviewed, and when a musician is giving that hype before they play, when they say, what can people expect? So the interviewer asked him, what can people expect in your show tomorrow? And he said they can expect songs that they haven't heard, songs that they have heard, and songs that I haven't heard, which I thought was interesting, right? So I was just thinking about that actually in relation to the moment, as I appreciate what the Oral History Project has done, that I'm hoping that tonight, in the anecdotes, in what we are sharing, Aryeh will also hear things that he hasn't heard about himself, that he did, that he didn't realize were actually consequential. So that pivots actually to your question, because as in the era, the period that Nadine was speaking to, when Aryeh is executive director from 1970 to 78 of the ACLU, as he starts that executive directorship, I'm being born myself. And as he finishes it, I'm running around without shoes in Zimbabwe, where I was born, as a young boy. But at that point in time, we have, of course, 2 years to go, and we have independence in Zimbabwe. The same way that, as you say, Lenny, we had institutions that were promising, that were brought about by the constitutional dispensation in 1994 in South Africa. So there is a burgeoning opportunity here for democracy and for open society and for human rights. But then we begin to see the retreat that you are talking about. So to my mind, I think what Aryeh has contributed in this context has been 5 very specific things that I will briefly highlight. I think one has been to say, this is an ongoing struggle, guys. It's not where we started. When he started off with the sort of East and West work at Open Society, in his partnership with George Soros, when he made his trip to Sarajevo with Abramovich, with Fred Cuny and others in 1993-94, thereabouts, and when they were supporting people with water purification and so on, the humanitarian interventions in Sarajevo, but going beyond that, beginning also to help open society beyond perestroika and glasnost in the East. But I think he began to see that this is an ongoing struggle, and he began to impart that understanding. And precisely because of some of this retardation that we are seeing in the democratic project and the open society project, that sense of an open and ongoing struggle is an important frame for all of us that are in this room to work with, because we are called upon to renew our vows, as it were, with the struggle for open society and for democracy and for human rights. And there is no complacency because the systems that we have been fighting are not themselves complacent. So I think the one thing that he contributed at one level was institutions that support oversight and monitoring of democracy and pluralism. And I think at a second level, Aryeh contributed with respect to people and communities, individuals and communities. So if you look at work like Roma, for instance, where he supported not only scholarships together with George Soros for Roma students, where you could actually count across the 10 to 12 million Roma people in Central and Eastern Europe, how many have PhDs, and you could actually see a difference between where we started and where we were going in terms of how many were being equipped to actually have capacity. And then where you would also actually say, here are so many people that now are able to read with their children in a sort of early childhood intervention with Roma people. So things like scholarships, things like Muslims in EU cities, where across 11 European cities, Aryeh had a project where essentially you would support the participation in the polity of Muslim communities and also working against discrimination against them. And the third level, I think, has been about norms and standards. In all the ways that Nadine, I think you were articulating, one you were articulating on an ongoing basis. So we know how important it has been beyond the Second World War emergence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for us to have the normative infrastructure that has emerged. But that normative infrastructure has not been the be-all and end-all of what needs to be done. It has needed to be activated, to be made real, to be tested, to be pushed through litigation, through advocacy, and so on. And Aryeh contributed in various ways in open society, in his open society ways to do that. And I think a fourth dimension has been the way he has contributed with respect to technical skills, technology, ways of doing things. If you take, for instance, something close to what you are raising in your question, in 1987, George Soros had called Aryeh when he was still at Human Rights Watch for his opinion on how to support an effort where Francois Slabbert, who had been leader of the progressives in parliament and had resigned a year before, he wanted to put together 50 prominent white South Africans and 50 black South Africans to come together and actually begin to break bread together and begin to talk to each other. And George Soros was talking to Aryeh and Neier about how best to do this and so on. And later, one of the people that actually was working with Francois Slabbert was Alex Borein, who was a cleric in South Africa, was talking in Budapest in the Open Society as to Aryeh about how to do the same beyond the moment actually of the formation of IDASA, which is the organization they had put together that time to help white people talk to black people in South Africa, but to begin to think about truth and reconciliation, right? So here is a moment where you can actually see skills that had been practiced in one place being imported into another, or in one era being imported into another. And then lastly, and fifth, I think an area where Aryeh has also contributed in the open society approach has been the idea that you can actually offer solidarity across time and place. So for those of us who have been victims, including at a personal level, of nationalist states that have gone rogue, that have denied people's rights and so on, and they have received solidarity. And for Africans in the context of South Africa, as you said, that wanted to see better, but started to see a recession in some of the gains that had been made initially, at least normatively with the Constitution. Having solidarity, not just during apartheid, but beyond that, from across the world. For Roma people, having solidarity. For anyone where they are situated, the Rohingya, having solidarity. For the Uyghurs, having solidarity. A framework where solidarity was actually made something that we aspire towards and we take for granted. I think that has been one of, again, the contributions of Aryeh and Neier. So in those frames, I would think we are at a moment of recession, yes, or at least threat to human rights as we have known them, but because of the framework of ongoing struggle that Aryeh purposed, helped frame, and helped sustain, I think we are poised to actually continue to do the real fight that's needed.
Tawanda, nicely done. I think Nadine is going to comment on that, and then I'd like to move away a bit from the hagiography and offer a little critique just to get the juices going, if that's okay. But Nadine, first.
Thank you both so much for your eloquent comments. And I have to chime in on the, all of us as activists, we have to be optimists, so we always see the glass half full, right? More than half full. And one of the perspectives, not at all, so we stopped the fight, but for exactly the opposite reason, to have the encouragement and inspiration and reasonable hope that we can succeed if we persist. So I think it's really, as one of the senior members here, having a bit of a longer view, I think it's really important to roll the clock back to where we were when Aryeh began his towering career in these fields in the early 1960s. And if you see how much progress that would have been unimaginable then has been made despite the recession, I think that's a really, really important perspective to have. And fortunately, younger people today may not be aware of how bad things were, how many rights they take for granted, how many causes they take for granted that were invented by Aryeh, that were not even part of I guess the international human rights movement didn't really exist at that point. But even with respect to civil liberties, at the beginning of this wonderful memoir, first volume, Aryeh, that's a hint, we're waiting for volume 2. I must say he hasn't committed to writing it, so we have to encourage him. But Aryeh says this: when I began in the early 1960s, it would have been possible to assemble in a good-sized living room all those professionally engaged in the United States in defending rights. A somewhat smaller room could accommodate their counterparts from the rest of the world. You know, Aryeh is not given to hyperbole, so that is not an overstatement, or it's not an understatement of how tiny these movements were at the time. And when Aryeh took over at the NYCLU, he ended up spending his time and putting the organization on the map, and more importantly, advancing rights for people and causes that were not even conceived as being part of the civil liberties, human rights agenda then.
Like disabilities.
Disabilities, rights of the mentally disabled, rights of the intellectually challenged, even rights of prisoners and other incarcerated and other institutionalized populations. Those were causes that were very dear to Aryeh, but were completely new. And dare I say, women's rights and reproductive freedom were also not taken for granted as part of these movements. Allusions have been made to Aryeh's genius for spotting talent. Among others, he hired Ruth Bader Ginsburg to become the founding director of the ACLU Women's Rights Project. And, you know, beyond that, Aryeh, I was just stunned in the 8 years that Aryeh was at the ACLU, and it's surprising to me. It's amazing to me, Jamil. I agree with you. He's such a legend and such a huge influence and inspiration at the ACLU that it was only 8 years and to have such an ongoing stamp. But during those 8 years, he hired 3 people who got the MacArthur Genius Award, and that's, I could give many other accolades.
He's also on the selection committee.
So I just want to end on that note of hope and how much progress we've made and how much more progress we're going to continue to make to carry forward Aryeh's tradition.
Wonderful. Nadine, some points that I'd like to hear anybody's thoughts on that perhaps were a bit more questionable, or people had a degree of skepticism towards with respect to Aryeh's principles. One was, of course, the old bugaboo of social and economic rights. And I wonder, looking at 2024 and thinking about rights as being enshrined for civil and political purposes, but not social and economic, did Aryeh miss the boat with that, or did his fierce commitment and devotion to a particular kind of rights, ultimately that integrity won out? That's one question. The second thing is, I remember at some point, Aryeh felt that like the human rights movement, like the women's movement, like the environmental movement, there was a time propitious to have a global anti-corruption movement. That didn't pan out in the way that the others did. And I'm curious your thoughts as to something that Aryeh was very concerned with and committed to, but that never really gelled. Any thoughts, Juan or Tawanda, on either of those?
Yeah, thank you, Lenny. I think Aryeh did get the whole idea that economic, social, and cultural rights matter. But I'll go along with poking the holes a little bit, as you said, so that it doesn't seem like a geography. So one possible weakness is that he didn't always emphasize that upfront. But I worked with Aryeh in many spaces and guises and understood the nuances. And I think the emphasis that he was putting was essential. If you look at his 1982 offering, Only Judgment, and in particular, the 2012 revision, 30 years later, when he revisits that book, one of the things that he emphasized was the lessons that had been learned along the way in terms of going beyond that Alexis de Tocqueville dictum that he starts off with in Only Judgment, that the very idea that courts can render things that are done by the executive and the legislature unconstitutional is important, actually, as a way to push back on the caprices and tyranny of assemblies. But he goes beyond that and says it's not just about what litigation can do to the tyranny of assemblies. It is also about how much it raises agendas and influences agendas, how much it constitutes particular communities into groups in a legal way, formal way that they hadn't done, things that Jim Goldstone, who is here, and others have since articulated over the years in their work. And it is within this context that he also says, we realize in the course of doing strategic litigation that sometimes it can actually be a weapon that's also abused by corporates, by others, because of the complex public policy questions that arise that need to be mediated when one is doing strategic litigation. But some of the inspiration that Aryeh was also working with and projecting in his economic, social, and cultural rights work was what has been happening in South Africa, as you know, Lenny, where the Rolls-Royce Constitution that South Africa got in 1994 became one of the sites of very important strategic litigation in the economic, social, and cultural rights area, in cases like Treatment Action Campaign, and which was looking at access to antiretrovirals and nevirapine in the context of HIV/AIDS, in cases such as Grootboom, which was looking at access to housing for the unhoused, and so on. So my sense has been that when you look at the nuance, I think he has been there. Just a quick remark on the second point that you make. My sense has been that on the point around institutions that I indicated, my first encounter with Aryeh was when I was at Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa. And I was an executive director then, Bin knows that time when we worked together. He walked across to me and said, I have been told that you are responsible for human rights and democracy building. And I said, yes. And then he said, I would hope that at the very least, one of the things that we should ensure is that in every country where you are working, we have a credible, independent, effective organization that is monitoring human rights in that country. So if you look at it from that standpoint, I think Aryeh was able to seed, protect, sustain institutions across all manner of areas, including anti-corruption institutions that today are doing work such as work that is developed into what the Revenue Watch Institute, as it started, was doing, what the Caspian Revenue Watch effort was doing, what Global Witness has been doing, and so on. So those efforts around oversight and monitoring of human rights, including anti-corruption, including illicit financial flows, I think have been actually a tribute to that very vision. That would be my take.
I was general counsel when Human Rights Watch decided finally to incorporate economic, social, and cultural rights into our mandate. And I have to say that was a little after Aryeh had left, but Aryeh's position on the idea of a narrow mandate was very well discussed and articulated amongst ourselves. I mean, I always thought that Aryeh was very much in favor of social justice generally. He just felt that when everything is governed by human rights, then we diminish the value of what we do for some specific human rights. So it was important for us to make sure that if we brought on board a larger group of rights, that we did so effectively, that we did so consciously about what mechanisms we can bring to bear to fulfill economic, social, and cultural rights. And we don't just say we do economic, social, and cultural rights and then treat them in the same manner as we treat civil and political rights. Because in the end, we are also downplaying or shortchanging economic, social, and cultural rights if we don't recognize them for their own value and their own the methodologies that are needed to incorporate them and to work effectively for them. So I think the fact that Aryeh had a very strong philosophical position on the question of whether economic, social, and cultural rights deserve to be considered rights, despite the fact that they had already been incorporated in treaties, but philosophically helped us, come to grips with, if we're going to do economic, social, and cultural rights, how we're going to do it and under what principles. And we particularly decided at the time to concentrate on remedies and particularly on allowing civil society and societies in general to have institutions to promote and fulfill economic, social, and cultural rights, and for us to report on their violations in a different manner than we did violations, for example, of the right to life and the right to personal integrity. And I think in that sense, the debate benefited us, and I think it benefited the rest of the international human rights movement as well. And on the question of anti-corruption, I also feel that you're right, Lenny, that despite some efforts, it hasn't really reached the level of incorporation into the agenda of the human rights movement the way we would have thought. And since I don't work on that area very much, I hesitate to give a kind of a reason for why that has been difficult to do. But one thing that disappoints me a lot is that sometimes anti-corruption seems to be a weapon to put down the political adversary in the political arena in democratic societies, or at least struggling democratic societies. It's become such a vicious circle of taking turns in, we are in government now, we're going to persecute everybody as corrupt, that people have lost faith in it. I mean, that doesn't mean that it cannot be done well. Whether it can be done well also just as an appendix to human rights is also probably not a good idea. I think anti-corruption has to have its own rules, its own principles of impartiality on it, and then maybe it can succeed.
Great. In terms, Juan, of the Human Rights Watch lore to which you refer, it will be interesting to read Ken Roth's memoir that is published, that will be published this January, to see how he interprets these particular conundra. We have just around 6.5 minutes here, but I wanted to ask Nadine, because you mentioned, of course, Aryeh's text, Defending My Enemy, and what came out of Skokie, that I think the story is well known. If we look at the conversation today about speech, about academic freedom, have we made progress? Because Aryeh would say to me very powerfully that what happened at Skokie allowed for a conversation around speech at the dinner tables in, Ames, Iowa, in a way that it would otherwise never have. And it was a sea change, a true civic engagement with a fundamental part of our history, our constitutional, our legal, and in fact, our moral history. Now, here we are 50 years later, and we see campuses exploding where academic freedom and free speech is often conflated as the same thing. Have we made any progress?
I'm put in mind of a famous statement by one of Aryeh's predecessors as ACLU Executive Director, Roger Baldwin. Before I quote Roger Baldwin, let me say that Roger said that Aryeh was the best executive director of the ACLU, perhaps even exceeding himself. So, and Roger said famously, "No fight for civil liberties ever stays won." These conversations were incredibly essential, and yet they have to be replicated, right? They have to be replicated every generation, person by person, campus by campus, dinner table by dinner table, and that's why I wrote my book, trying to repeat in today's context some of the great lessons that we learned from Skokie, but have to keep relearning and re-experiencing. And that's exactly why I think it's so important to have this book republished, because Aryeh's story, and he incorporates his personal story into the book, conveys the message, the free speech message, with a unique power. I mean, here is somebody who is himself a Holocaust survivor, whose entire extended family is murdered by the Nazis, who goes through enormous suffering before getting to the United States as a refugee, and his hatred of the Nazis and of Nazism and fascism comes out so powerfully in this book. To have somebody with that background and that foreground say, as much as I loathe the Nazis, I love free speech even more. And I love it because it is the only way that we can possibly defeat Nazism and fascism. So it's not just an abstract, the abstract reasoning is, as you would expect, as brilliant and as scholarly as other things that Aryeh has written, but the personal passion and experience that comes through is so important. And that's why every time I ask somebody, and I should say, when the book has been out of print, I should have said this, Aryeh has never asked that anybody pay $400 to get it off Amazon. To the contrary, many years ago, he gave me complete permission to distribute it completely free. I have a PDF of the book, and I will offer it to anybody who's interested. So generous, and yet everybody who has read that book, people will tell me, I was so skeptical. I really disagreed, and it changed my mind. Now, not everybody is going to change their minds, but they will have a much deeper understanding and much more openness to the pro-civil liberties, pro-speech perspective, not only from the perspective of abstract theoretical value of free speech, but as the most effective way to counter hatred and discrimination. And I'm sorry I didn't say that when I had this fantasy of Aryeh being president of Columbia University, because he would have gone beyond a sterile defense of free speech. It's not enough to allow the hate mongers, as happened in Skokie. And
is it fair to say that Aryeh would probably have not named names to that troglodyte, Elise Stefanik?
No, I was also going to say he would have stood up against the pressure in Congress. I did a panel recently with, I'm going to name names here, David Cole, until recently legal director of the ACLU. We both spoke at Georgetown last week, and I was critical of the Columbia president for being complicit in throwing faculty members under the bus and not standing up for academic freedom, and showing that we can have disagreement within the ACLU, our ACLU alumni. David said, well, she wasn't complicit. She was being browbeaten. And I said, now I'm going to say, if Aryeh had been president, he would not have allowed himself to be browbeaten. He's been in many tribunals that were at least as hostile, in which he courageously, tenaciously insisted on defending whatever the principles were. But in this case, he would have insisted on using the university's great resources to stimulate learned, informed discussion and debate that would not just be warring camps of students shouting conclusory epithets at each other. It would have been an opportunity for learning and discussion and deepening and enriching our understanding of the background of the conflict and looking forward to positive potential solutions.
And making Roger Baldwin and Norman Thomas proud. We are now out of time. Evan, next up is Q&A. Even better. Aryeh, it's all you now. So you have the floor to respond, to query, to opine, whatever you like.
I don't want to get into any of the substance, although if anybody has questions, I would respond with respect to issues of substance. I'm amazed that so many people turned out for an event of this sort. I have participated in a great many panels, but I've never previously been the subject of a panel. And this is a new experience for me, and I'm sort of taking it in. I do want to thank particularly Claudia Hernandez, who initiated this effort. She worked particularly with Alex Krasnai at the Open Society Foundations in getting this underway. I also want to express thanks to you, Lenny, to Nadine, to Juan, and to Tawanda. I should say that having worked in the rights field for a long time, essentially since I started work for the ACLU in 1963, so some 61 years ago, I've in a way had it easy. I've had it easy because I've never worked in a context in which I faced reprisals for undertaking this activity. I mean, Juan Mendez was imprisoned, tortured, lived in exile from the country of his birth, would likely have been a disappeared person if there had not been some immediate intercession in his behalf. There are people who have worked in the rights field who have sacrificed a great deal to work in that field. As I say, I've had it easy. I haven't had to sacrifice in order to work in this field. And I can't think of anything that I would rather have done. I've had the opportunity to be associated with 3 institutions, and in a way it's difficult to separate my own activities. In fact, it's impossible to separate my own activities from the institutions. In forming a panel this evening, I was asked to suggest who should be on it, and I wanted one person associated with each of the institutions with which I've been associated. And so I suggested Nadine and Juan and Tawanda as persons who have been in leading positions in those institutions. And I'm very glad that I proposed them as the panel for this evening. I'm tempted to get into a debate like the one about economic and social rights. I will only say this about that, that I believe very strongly in advancing fairness in the distribution of economic resources. I just don't think it can be achieved through the rights process. I think it has to be achieved through the democratic process. I think that the democratic process essentially has to deal with 2 issues. One issue is the security of the state, and the other issue is the distribution of economic resources within the state. And I don't think that philosophically one can withdraw from the democratic process and subject, say, to judicial decision-making a question such as the distribution of economic resources. And so that's my basic reason for not being a champion of economic and social rights. I don't know any place in the world where the rights process has had a significant impact in redistributing economic resources within the country. There have been a few cases where that has happened successfully, but they are relatively marginal matters. In South Africa, for example, the Treatment Action Campaign, and incidentally, we provided the financial support for its efforts in South Africa, despite my views on economic and social rights. The Treatment Action Campaign brought the litigation in South Africa that resulted in the availability of nevirapine, which prevented the transmission of HIV from mother to child. And that's always cited as one of the great examples, perhaps the leading example of where a court was able to deal with a question of economic and social rights. And in India, there has been a significant role that the courts have played, for example, in providing support for free meals in public schools in India. So that's another example. But there aren't many examples where the rights process has had a significant impact in terms of advancing economic equality. And I think diverting efforts from the democratic process would be a mistake. Imagine if in the United States the Supreme Court had done the equivalent of enacting Obamacare. It couldn't have happened in the United States. There would have been a revolution which would have prevented that. It had to take place through the legislative process, through the democratic process in the United States. So look, I could get into other matters that you've discussed. I said I wasn't going to take on those issues, but I have a hard time resisting to some extent. But if anybody has questions for me, I'd be happy to try to address them.
So now's our time. We have actually an extra 5 minutes, so we have around 20 minutes for questions and responses. So step right up. Ren Weschler, I assume you have something to say.
Hey, Aryeh. A twofold question. Has your confidence in democracy been shaken by the fact that we are at a 49% to 49% election?
I'm not hearing.
Okay.
So.
Aryeh, just a twofold question. Has your confidence bedrock confidence in democracy been shaken by the fact that we are in a 49 to 49% election coming up here? And then after that, will your confidence in the courts continue not to be shaken if we have 4 years more of Republican nominations to the Supreme Court and all the other courts and so forth? At what point does that become a problem?
Every institution that one could devise is limited in its capacity by the persons who are prominent in those institutions. And I don't know a way to guarantee that democratic processes will produce enlightened leaders. I don't know a way to be absolutely sure that we're going to get judicial officials who will be enlightened. But I do think that the fundamental notion of distributing powers between different branches of government and having certain areas which are decided on the basis of rights. And I think the judiciary is an appropriate body to have a significant impact on rights, and to have a democratically elected body deal with issues of security and economic distribution seems to be about as good as a division of powers as we're able to establish. I can't think of a better way to address those issues.
This is on. Hi, Aryeh. Maybe this is a slightly longer version of asking whether there's a regret you might share, but I wanted to pick up on the sort of second phase of the panel discussion and ask if there's a strategic decision or either a victory or defeat that didn't have the staying power impact that you might have hoped, and if you reflect back on that and might share it. I'm a sucker for an Aryeh anecdote, so perhaps it's also just hoping for one.
I'm sorry, my hearing is poor, and so I didn't quite get.
I'm happy to repeat. So if there's a strategic decision or either victory or defeat that you were involved in that you look back on or looked back on with regret and wished for a different outcome.
You know, I mentioned one thing in the book that Nadine cited, the Taking Liberties book. Early in my career at the ACLU, and my total career was 15 years, Nadine, not just the 8 years that I was the national director. Early in my career, I got the ACLU involved in dealing with the rights of mental patients and the rights of the developmentally disabled. And I consider the efforts we engaged in on behalf of the developmentally disabled to be an immense success, and the effort that we engaged in on behalf of mental patients to be a failure. I think I contributed to that failure. The reason that we were successful with respect to the developmentally disabled, people who were in those days referred to as the mentally retarded, and there were hundreds of thousands then in institutions in the United States, and there are relatively small numbers in institutions today. But it was a great success for principally two reasons. One reason was that in the litigation that we conducted, such as the Willowbrook litigation here in New York, we persuaded the courts that confinement in an institution for the developmentally disabled, such as Willowbrook, exacerbated developmental disability. And we got the courts to agree that there had to be compensatory efforts to provide assistance for the developmentally disabled. And that has persisted ever since. And so it has cost over the years billions of dollars, but in fact, many of those who are developmentally disabled receive assistance that enables them to live outside institutions and to get along rather well, whereas in the institutions for the developmentally disabled that existed all over the United States, conditions when we got started were horrendous. And the other factor was a difference in the nature of developmentally disability from mental illness. Ordinarily, developmental disability is recognized by families at birth or soon after birth. And many parents of the developmentally disabled become, if anything, more attached to their disabled children than they are to children who don't have that disability. And they become an effective lobbying force on behalf of the developmentally disabled. Whereas with respect to the mentally ill, it ordinarily becomes apparent in adolescence or early adulthood, and it often produces antagonism between the mentally ill person and the parents. And the parents cannot be enlisted as an effective lobby on behalf of the mentally ill. And we weren't able to persuade the courts that there had to be compensatory efforts for confinement in mental institutions for the mentally ill. As a result, local jails around the United States house a great many people who are mentally ill, and some portion of the homeless population consists of people who are mentally ill. And so the fact that we were not able to secure significant state efforts to provide for the mentally ill meant that getting them out of the institution didn't significantly or didn't in any way improve their situation. So I consider the efforts on behalf of the mentally ill a failure, and I consider the efforts on behalf of the developmentally disabled a great success. And if I think of failures, that would be at the top of my list of failures that I've been engaged in.
Aryeh, just on that note, you had convened in the 80s with Tom Bender a conversation about the Bronx Development Center.
Yes.
Which has been sadly destroyed. It was a kind of modernist masterpiece by the architect Richard Neier.
Listed in various architectural guides as a masterpiece.
But what was it specifically about the Bronx Development Center that you felt was really avant-garde in terms of its design?
It was all wrong, even though it was an architectural masterpiece. I was once with the famous architect Richard Neier, who designed the building, and somebody who was with me asked Richard Neier, why did you put these windows at the floor level in the institution? And he said, because I went to an institution for the developmentally disabled, and I saw that they were lying on the ground, and therefore I wanted them to be able to look out the window. And he didn't understand that the point was not to have them lying on the ground, to have them sitting up and standing up, and that it was mistaken in that respect. The other thing that was wrong about the building was that after getting people out of Willowbrook into a place like the Bronx Developmental Center, the point was to get them ready for living in apartments in regular neighborhoods. And the apartments they would live in looked nothing like that architecturally magnificent building. And so a much more humdrum building would have served the purposes much better than the masterpiece that he designed.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions, please. We don't have time for a few more questions, but let this be our last question.
Well, in the last 50 years, the modern technology, social media have considerably amplified the capacity to propagate lies, to manipulate public opinion. Do you think that free speech and the existing body of law to protect free speech is enough to counterbalance that new capacity?
It protects free speech. I'm sorry, I didn't hear completely well.
I'm asking, in recent years, technology, social media have enormously amplified the capacity to propagate lies, to manipulate public opinion. Do you think that the body of law that protects free speech needs to be adapted, or as it stands, can respond to that threat?
I have great difficulty in dealing with that issue. I really don't think of myself as having an appropriate response to that question. I do think that the technology of communication has to be considered as we deal with free speech issues today. I don't want to see any suppression of points of view, but I'm not completely satisfied that I know how to answer your question. I'd rather defer to Nadine on a question of that sort.
Look, Aryeh still wrote in longhand till 2014. So this is not his forte. But why don't we speak with Nadine, of course, and others during the reception that we're a bit late to. But let me just thank everyone so much for the participation.